Okay, welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. I'm, of course, your host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Kelly Mentaleone. Kelly, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. You got a great series going here.
Thank you so much. I worked really hard on it, and this is a celebratory episode. I just remembered this that we've been doing this program for 3 years now.
Congratulations. That's great news.
I think it's wonderful news. So, Kelly, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my current title is an underwater anthropologist, and most people have never heard of it. I think it might be a new title. My background is as an underwater archaeologist. And so I look at where people would have lived, hunted, gathered, our usual archaeological sites, but out on the continental shelf. So I'm looking at places that are now submerged. And my research for the last 15 years now has been in Southeast Alaska, um, where the sea level has changed by as much as 175 meters since the last glacial maximum. And this is most likely the root of how people came to be south of the continental glaciers when they first came to the Americas. So we've got tons of potential out here. Where I am now, finally, is working for the local heritage organization. So Alaska's set up a little differently than the other states. In Alaska, we have something called ANSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which means that the villages, the corporations are all incorporated, and then there's regional corporations too. So they created a Southeast Alaska corporation called Sea Alaska. Sea Alaska decided to create a nonprofit heritage organization under their purview that then supports the growth of and cultural heritage within the region. And they do some amazing programs. And I got brought on here at Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, this not-for-profit organization, this summer, where I can now focus on my research in Southeast Alaska. So it's kind of fun and odd.
It kind of sounds like it's a little bit of a mixture of an educational organization, but also like a cultural organization also.
Yeah, so we, as an organization, they run lots of classes, and we do a lot of preservation type things. So I'm currently sitting in the archive right now, which you can't tell because I have my background on. But we have a vault with artifacts and things that have been, artistically created, some old, some modern books, and like things you normally find in a museum. We have a museum collection, but we also have a store where we sell native crafts. And then an entire education department, an entire art department. So they do some really interesting things here. We even have a couple linguists on staff that work on translating things into the local languages. Here we have the Tlingit, Haida, and Timian peoples. And so we've got a really rich culture here.
So I know Alaska is in kind of its own space as far as working with tribes go. They aren't considered part of the First Nation tribes of Canada, are they?
Oh, so I'm Canadian, but Alaska is separate. But actually, the Tlingit, and the Haida, and the Simian are all also Canadian First Peoples. I've been using that on grants in Canada for a while, trying to apply for funding in the US that I haven't been successful on, is that the Alaskan tribes actually have Canadian counterparts. And some of the indigenous peoples in Alaska especially have dual citizenship between the US and Canada.
That's really interesting. I never thought about that. That representation, like I said, Alaska is in like its own space culturally. Like I'm not gonna say it's like cut off from the rest of the United States, but it's in its own like cultural circle in its little area that it stays in.
And there's a lot of overlap with Washington and Oregon, but it does fit much, especially the Northwest coast. That really is British Columbia to a large extent, a little bit of Yukon. And so it fits very well with a lot of the Canadian research, and we overlap a fair bit between the different research groups that way. The line's very arbitrary between Canada and the US in this region.
So, what role does an underwater anthropologist or archaeologist play?
I like that you use both terms. That's what I usually do too. So as an anthropologist, I'm working on modern issues that are affecting the local people. So we've identified through local Tlingit harvesters and Haida harvesters have identified that there's a film on black seaweed, edible seaweed that people eat here, similar to the seaweed you buy in the store in the sheets. Same similar species. And so it's harvested locally here and by people all over the area, and they've noticed a film on it in different places. And so we're looking into that. And my role is we realize we don't have any ethnographic information about it. So I'm working on developing an ethnography of the black seaweed use throughout Southeast Alaska. And that's the anthropology side of it. On the archaeology side, I'm just wrapping up a grant with NOAA Ocean Explorations looking for submerged caves on the continental shelf of Southeast Alaska. And I'm applying for more funding to continue looking at landscapes underwater.
So to study the seaweed, are you actually going and collecting the seaweed, or are you going and talking to the people who use it, or both?
So I'm going to talk to the people who use it, and there's a whole distribution network. But I have a colleague who works in our education department who's actually developing a proposal and funding like programming for sampling to try to identify more about the biological effect of a diatom on seaweed. Less archaeology, more biology, which is what her PhD is in.
I mean, that sounds really fascinating because I assume the seaweed they have there isn't found in a lot of other places.
It's actually very similar. If it's not the same species, it's very similar species that we're seeing in Southeast Alaska along the BC coast. And then that nori you're buying in the store is a related species.
And that is why my degrees are in history and archaeology, because I'm not a biologist.
You get asked to write proposals on things like that, though. You kind of just go in, you learn, and you do it. But my background's always been on the science side, so I do more geomorphology and marine geophysics. So biology is a little bit further outside my realm, but I kind of have to understand it a fair bit as I work with palynologists, and I have a lady I work with who does dinoflagellate cyst analysis. That's what I'm doing on my current NOAA project. And then my proposal, we're looking at sedimentary ancient DNA or cetDNA, and then diatoms, and again, pollen. So I work with enough people who I have to understand enough of the biology that you have to stay relatively current on some of these topics from high school.
It sounds really involved, though.
Yes, yes. Yes, it is. But the fun part is, and it's kind of a new thread, is with the sediments that I've been collecting underwater is I'm looking for micro debitage. So it was proposed over 50 years ago by Knut Vladmark that every time somebody's flint napping, we find debitage and we find lithic tools as archaeologists. But microscopically, there would be a radius of very fine, under 1 millimeter flakes created that should have the same properties as other debitage and flakes that are created in this process. So in the sediments that I'm looking at, I'm looking for microscopic debitage under 1 millimeter in size to see if we can identify the presence of humans in these sediments.
So, just to make sure I understand what you're talking about, is when a person is flint napping, there's a radius around them that when they're actually shaping something, there's a microscopic just ring around them of stuff that is flaked off from what they're working on, and that's what you're looking for.
Yes, because that would have ended up in the sediments around you. It's not like now when you're going to come around and vacuum up afterwards, which I assume people put tarps down and clean up the tarp when they leave, because it creates so much very sharp material when you do flint napping. Do you flint nap?
No, I don't have talent or commitment, so no, I don't do that.
I don't have the hand-eye coordination, so I have a hard time with flint napping, but I've done it and I've got the bruises from it. But yeah, so you get this like mess around you, and they've used this in other places, and the person who has been writing up about this most is Lisa Sonnenberg, who's with the Canadian Park Service, and has worked with John O'Shea in the Great Lakes, and her dissertation work and her postdoc work actually use this to find sites in the Great Lakes.
So you're saying that this is research that could apply to really anywhere that someone has used stone tools, not just centered in Alaska.
Oh, yes. And it's not just underwater. It's just underwater. We have so many other restrictions of things, ways to look for things, that a sediment core is usually the easiest way to get some dirt up.
Mm-hmm.
Usually archaeologists were digging pretty big holes, but I don't know if you've been out on a project where you just take little sediment cores to figure out what's going on, not even full shovel test, just a sediment core, and either you analyze it there or back in the lab. And those sediment cores can actually have a fair bit in them. Now, there's a small chance you'll find an artifact in a 2-inch sediment core, but you can completely find microscopic evidence of flint napping.
So once you have collected sediment samples, I assume you take it back to the lab and you take it through a process to actually pick up the tiny, tiny, tiny pieces.
I should take my my screen off background and you can see what I've been doing actually. 2 seconds to remove my background. Where is it? None. All right. So behind me. So I have sediment samples over my left shoulder in Ziploc baggies, and over my right shoulder here, you can see a pile of screens, and they're 1 millimeter, half a millimeter, and 0.25 millimeter screens. So we're talking small.
Mm-hmm.
Before they get to the screen, the samples are soaked in peroxide to kill any organic material because I'm looking for stones. Once they're dry, I put them through the screens, and then I actually just have a handheld microscope that I use. Now, if I have things that look like flakes, I will likely need to find a higher resolution microscope that I have. But you can see why my mess of my background is usually hidden. But it's something I can literally do at my desk here in my office to a
Well,
large
I
extent.
imagine since you're in Alaska this time of year, it's probably getting on the colder side.
Actually relatively warm here. I'll keep to Fahrenheit because I know that's what your audience knows. So it's 43 Fahrenheit right now here. I might be warmer than you because we're in a nice maritime climate here on the southeast coast of Alaska. And Juneau's relatively sheltered where I am. And so it's usually very rainy. It's a rainforest, which is the trees in the background. The background is from Southeast Alaska. And we get a lot of rain, but we don't get that much snow. I keep trying to explain it to people like a cold Seattle. But I haven't seen the sun in a while. Sunrise is like 8:30 in the morning and it sets at about 3:30 in the afternoon, and we still have a couple more weeks before we hit the winter equinox. So winter solstice, sorry. So it's a little dark here.
I was going to say that's very complicated.
Yeah, I go out at lunch and it's rainy or cloudy, so I haven't seen the sun in about 3 weeks.
Wow, that is really kind of sad and also kind of awesome at the same time that you live in a place where I guess I don't know if you necessarily call it the weather.
The climate.
Yes, there it is. I should
Yeah.
know that I should know the difference between the two.
That's that science, those science fields that they expect us to know as archaeologists, right?
I'm terrible at it.
That's kind of one of the worlds I live in because my research looking on underwater applies a lot to climate change. So I try to keep up with a lot of the climate change literature and understanding what they're forecasting. Because one of the interesting things I found with our sea level rise is there's I have the slide handy, which gives me the math correctly. Hold on, because otherwise I do the math wrong and it's really funny. There's something like a 50-meter sea level change in a matter of I can't get the math right without the slide. I'm sorry. I have external brains of things like slides to help me through these things. No, I don't have it in this deck. But the sea level changes at something like 5 centimeters a year. Our current sea level rise is 3 millimeters a year. So we're talking an order of magnitude difference. Now, I don't have a lot of data, so we can't confirm, exactly what rate that rise happened at. But in this window that I'm talking about 11,000 years ago, sea level was rising exponentially fast. and we know people were on this landscape. We have a place called Shukaka Cave, which has human remains whose name Shukaka. And there's a manuscript about Shukaka Cave and the excavations about it coming out in the next couple months, edited by James Dixon, and co-authored by people here at the Alaska Heritage Institute. And Shukaka dates to around 11,000 years ago. So we have people here then. And then last year, when I was out doing this cave survey, I couldn't get my side scan sonar to work. And I had a location I wanted to look at that I'd found on side scan sonar back in 2010 that I thought was a fish trap. We got up to this place and we dropped the ROV in the water. And I set up my ROV dive where I finally got to drive the ROV. It wasn't a technician. This was a smaller expedition than when we were looking back in 2010, 2012, 2013 under James Dixon. And so I set up the dive to actually go with the current. And we drifted right over to these low stone walls on the seafloor. Nothing around it. All of a sudden hit this. And I had a ship captain who's a local Haida out of Kawak. And he's in his captain's chair, hanging over the back of it, looking at the iPad that I'm driving the ROV on. And I'm starting to get a little happy here, looking at what I'm seeing. And he goes, oh my God, that's what they told me to look for. That's a fish trap. And I have this indigenous person just ecstatic to find his own cultural history down on the seafloor at 52 meters. And so we know people are there. And we know the sea level's rising really fast. And so there's so much potential to learn about how people have adapted to sea level rise in the past.
And that's something that you can actually document. I assume it's part of your job also as an underwater anthropologist slash archaeologist to document the sea level change where you are.
So a lot of that's been done by another Jim James Bechtel, who's retired from the U.S. Forest Service. Most of Southeast Alaska is actually Forest Service land. It's the Tongass National Forest. It's 17 million acres. The forest is. It's huge. And so they control most of the land in this area, and they do a lot of the research in this region. And so in the decades that Jim Bechtel worked for the Forest Service, he did some amazing work, and he collaborated with lots of students and geologists and other researchers, and us too, during my dissertation work. And he's helped create some amazing information about Southeast Alaska. And in 2021, he released a paper with sea level curves all over Southeast Alaska. Some of them only have a couple data points, but altogether it makes for a really interesting chronology of how the region has changed. And it's changing. Did you hear about the glacial flood that tore apart a couple houses here in Juneau this summer?
No, I have not.
So we have the Mendenhall Glacier here, which is a huge tourist destination. It's part of the Tongass National Forest. And one of the things that happens up by the glacier is a glacial lake forms. And it's an ice dam. And so when the lake reaches a certain point, that dam will break and it floods down the river. Now the river, this happens all the time, but it didn't break and it didn't break. And I started getting, flood warnings on my phone going, what's going on? What's going on? And then finally it broke. And when that dam broke, it ripped down the river so fast that it completely recarved parts of the river. It undercut one of the apartment buildings or condo buildings along the river. I believe one full house went in and a couple more just about fell in. So they have a really weird name for it, like a Jagger or something or other, and I'm not going to pronounce it right, even if I had the correct term. And so climate change is very prevalent here because that glacier has receded so much. The visitor center for the Mendenhall Glacier was actually set up beside the glacier when it was built. Don't ask me when, but a while ago. And now you can barely see the glacier from the visitor center. It's so far back.
That's really sad when you think about it.
And
Okay.
there's so many people coming to see that glacier each year. It's insane. But they go out on boats, they go up on helicopters, you go on some hikes. And there's some great views of it. And it's a
Oh yeah.
beautiful blue.
I mean, it's a glacier. How could it not be pretty?
And dangerous, but yes.
Oh yeah. I
Completely.
mean, half the things in the world are both pretty and dangerous. I mean, just look at half the snakes that live on the planet.
Oh, not here. We don't have those kind of things. I found a bug on my car the other day. It was like a grasshopper. I was shocked to see a bug.
Okay,
We see slugs.
I don't know how I would feel about living in a place that didn't have snakes and bugs, and that's 90% of what we deal with as archaeologists here in Alabama.
We have bugs. We have gnats that drive us crazy. This summer when we were doing field work, we had a film crew. Our dive team was a field crew, and they wanted to get some stylized shots as the sun was coming up. So they went out before dawn with two boats, and we're doing all these cool shots. And they all came back in, and they're covered in bug bites. And they're like, "What was it? What was biting us?" And we're like, "They're called no-see-ums because you can't see them."
Makes sense.
And there are these like little itsy bitsy little bugs that are like flies, or they're not even a mosquito, and they just bite you. It's really
That sounds
beautiful and
awful.
lovely. Yeah, because they're so small, you can't do anything about them. We eventually got a bottle of bug spray to share.
Eventually.
It took us about 4 more days before we finally got bug spray. They don't bug me, so I wasn't worried about it. But yeah, we had some people pretty well eaten alive. That was a fun season this year because we had a robot out with us.
Ooh.
It's named Sunfish. It's an autonomous underwater vehicle, and it's still being trained. So we had it tethered to the boat, which also meant we could see where it was going. And the team leading it would only give it 1 or 2 commands at a time. But we were able to do survey in very confined areas and really detailed survey of things. And the robot was actually designed to survey caves. And so it's most of its experience is doing caves, and it's been doing tunnels and stuff like that for other purposes too. But it allowed us to map a cave we were told about by local people. And we were able to look at a lot of other places this summer that we thought could have been caves. And we found some things that might have been in the past, but aren't now. Things where it looks like the landscape has changed in the last 10,000 years.
That's a
Things erode
reasonable.
underwater.
I was going to say that's a reasonable assumption to think that things have changed over 10,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, that's where I got my dirt from.
So, as an underwater anthropologist slash archaeologist, um, have you had to get any different certifications as opposed to, like, say, somebody who works in Florida would have to get for, I guess, the cold or the different environment from where you are?
I am still a wetsuit diver. We don't actually get to dive much in our work. So we usually use robots. That would be your big difference. Not technically. There are no regulations really in there's no common regulations across the agencies to do work in the US or Canada in underwater archaeology. It's really state specific or agency specific. So where you're getting your funding, universities will sometimes throw regulation in there. A while back, the state historic preservation officers here in Alaska had a bit of underwater archaeology experience and decided no one was diving unless they had Navy certification to dive. So it's kind of it changes with who knows what. Really, most people doing technical diving are in a dry suit, even in the warmer waters, because it allows you to be in the water longer. And so it's not that it's any more complicated up here than it is off the coast of California. Same kind of currents, just different, just slightly colder water. What is different here is I don't know how much cold water training they get when they're going out with NSF or other programs. Years ago, NSF actually sent our entire team off to a cold water boat training, which was really fun because I got to do it in Port Aranis, Texas.
Ooh.
So nice warm water. And they taught us how to drive small motor boats, and we had to do man overboard drills. We learned about getting in and out of safety suits and things like that. So it's more, coming from a landlocked area like Toronto, where I have a lake, to an ocean. I was doing my PhD in New Mexico in Albuquerque, and we would come up to Southeast Alaska and go out on a boat for 3 weeks or 2 weeks. And it would be things like, I would call it a bathroom, and the ship captain would go, "No, it's a head." I'd say kitchen, and he'd go, "No, it's a galley." And having to remember the lingo of being on a boat was really more the training than just the archaeology training, because they don't really teach that in most archaeology classes.
No, and I was really embarrassed the first time I went out on a boat with some people, and I didn't know the difference between port and starport. I was like, why can't you just say left and right? It makes it so much easier for everyone who's not me.
But it depends on which way you're looking on the boat. If you're facing the bow versus facing the stern, right and left change, but port and starboard never change.
There was one guy who was with us. He asked the captain if he could use stage directions, like stage left and stage right. I was like, that's not going to help anyone. Oh my God.
Oh, it doesn't help. Gotta remember the boat changes directions. I actually really regret recording things in port and starboard in my notes, because we do transit paths where we go back and forth. Like if you were doing like a ground penetrating radar survey, you just kind of do a path back and forth over a field. Same kind of idea of just doing it over the ocean. Well, so I say something is 20 meters to port. Well, now I need to know what direction we were heading at the time. And I'm getting better at remembering to do things like recording the heading in my notes too. But a lot of the times in my notes, I just put times and distances of what I'm seeing on the sonar. And then I have to go back through the sonar and figure out the heading and all of that, and then be able to map where the item was that I was looking at.
Well, Kelly, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. That's going to just about do it for today, everybody. Kelly, you want to throw out any last minute advice for anyone who's interested in learning more about Alaska or underwater anthropology slash archaeology?
I really recommend following the YouTube lecture series that Sea Alaska Heritage runs at Sea Alaska Heritage on YouTube, and I'll make sure that Daniel has the link to add. We've run some amazing series. We bring people in from all over. A lot of it is Tlingit, Haida, and Simian focused, but we have some much broader topics too. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you again for joining me. Again, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks.
All right, that's going to do it for us here today, everybody. Take care.